Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for coming out in the rain this afternoon to this panel. I'm Meera Selva. I'm the director of the Journalism Fellowship Program at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. But before that, I was kind of a financial reporter for various publications, including the Daily Telegraph, Handelsblatt, the German business publication. And I wanted to do this panel for two reasons. Firstly, we're coming up to 10 years since the financial crash, and it struck me it's a moment to reflect. And the bigger reason is the whole of the festival is about the future of journalism and trust in journalism and why we should exist and in what form our future should take. And here's our final panelist. Yes, so, in Bill we trust. And and it struck me that financial journalism is absolutely at the heart of this, and it's not something that's discussed, and it's still seen as something that's niche and slightly other to the rest of mainstream journalism, but the reasons we're going to discuss today, it's basically at the heart of journalism, and nothing else ultimately matters if we don't get this right, if we don't report, the business of making money, spending money, saving money, stealing money, then there's nothing else really. That's how society functions, so that's what I want to look at. So if I introduce my panelists the other way, to give Bill a moment to have some water, at the end there we've got Dean Starkman, who is the author of a fantastic book called The Watchdog That Didn't Bark, The Financial Crisis and the Disappearance of Investigative Journalism, which he'll talk about it himself, but it looks at the role of journalists in the financial crash and the kind of the interplay between the elites and the market makers and how we basically failed society and failed the people who are impacted by the crash the most. I also have here Alexandra Borchardt, who's a colleague at the Reuters Institute, but before that she was managing editor of Süddeutsche Zeitung, one of the most respected papers in the world, never mind Germany, and she ran the business news desk during the crash, so was kind of fully aware of how the stories came and what decisions were made and how quickly things were made and how hard it was to get a kind of sense of the big picture. She also set up a Plan W, which was a business magazine aimed at women, partly to frame the story in a different way, possibly a more female way, but just a different perspective on it. And on my side here, I have Bill Emmott, who's former editor of The Economist and has written far more than we'll ever touch on the subject, and it's also kind of specialized in Asia and Japan and looked at what Asia can teach us in Europe and America about dealing with these issues. So that's the panel. Like I said, I started my career at the Daily Telegraph business desk, and it was based in the City of London at the time. And it was terrific because I was kind of, South Asian, grew up in Wales, not part of this elite world. And to work on the desk, I suddenly had this into all these amazing little lanes around the back of the Bank of England with names like Poultry and putting, it's just like kind of medieval lane. And I had a real sense that I had an exclusive access to this hidden world, which was absolutely true. I did. It was a kind of exclusive, closed world. And if you look at the origins of business reporting in the UK, that's exactly what it was. Its roots are in the marketplace, in the coffee houses of the 17th, 18th century. There were places to exchange information about prices and later about trading conditions and risks. And it folded in some gossip. But it was basically information that was exchanged for profit on a semi-exclusive basis. That's where kind of financial journalism started in the UK. I mean, and the role of exchange of information speeded up with the introduction of the telegraph in the 1840s, but it was still very much an exclusive thing. And there's a very wonderful story about Julius Reuter, founder of the eponymous news agency, going to Rothschild and saying, I've got this terrific idea for setting up a kind of service that will disseminate information on prices widely and quickly. And Rothschild said, no, that's a terrible idea. Why would I want to be involved in that? We're eating our own business. Of course, Julius Reuter went and set that up anyway. And there is an argument that marked the beginning of the decline of Rothschilds, which since the Napoleonic era had been the holder of this information. And when basically a news person came along, an agency person came along and said, we need to disseminate this information wider in a more consistent way, the banks lost a lot of their power. In the US, it's a slightly different scenario. And I think financial journalism has been kind of the origins of investigative reporting in the US in many ways, from the turn of the 20th century, finding out about big businesses, the kind of the reporting on Exxon and Standard Oil kind of was the first key example of, muckrakers in a way, like journalists just kind of going through officially available data, but try and find out the story. I run a journalism program at Reuters Institute that brings in a lot of experienced reporters from around the world. And what I'm talking about here is just, it's not a kind of Western phenomena as well. There's a huge amount of anger in all continents about the role of the media in the financial crash, about how betrayed people felt. A report from Botswana said it became really clear how little we knew about the diamond industry, even though it makes up 45% of our GDP. And when after the crash, sales fell by 30%. You can imagine what impact this had on a sub-Saharan country, and people just had no way of getting information. The only information they had was via South Africa. And in Dubai, which is not really known for its press freedom, the heaviest censorship post the crash was on the financial press. It was completely forbidden to report about property dealings. And you had a very strange scenario where a lot of Western reporters had gone out there before the crash to report on what was basically a booming, emerging market, and then found out they weren't allowed to utter a word about the crash. So you ended up with a lot of kind of wealth porn, but a lot of focus on insanely expensive hotels, but again, nothing about sovereign wealth funds, about how oil, or corruption. And my final point about why this matters is Edelman, which is a public relations company, has done a barometer, the Trust Barometer, which is very good on their website, which measures trust on the media around the world. And they have measured very specifically that trust plummeted after the crash. For the reason that there was kind of tremendous anger at the media and other market participants over the crash. This year, for the first time ever, it's going back up. And trust in legacy media, in old traditional media that we all here really represent, is going back up. So it's a tremendous opportunity to not waste, waste the lessons that should have been learned, and to look at, okay, if we can win this trust back, we can really start discussing the future of the media and where we go from that again. So thank you for that. And on that note, I'm just going to hand over to Dean to start.
Thank you, Meera. Thanks, everyone, for coming. It's nice to see such a big turnout. And I'm very grateful to Meera, especially, for organizing this panel on this particular subject, because I feel like I've been living in a post-crisis world since September 15th, 2008. I'm currently based at the Central European University in Budapest, Hungary, which, as some of you may know, is under threat from a quasi-authoritarian government, which is just one of the many gifts of the financial crisis of 2008. I have this presentation. I hope I don't, try to cram too much into a very short space of time. I'm going to keep looking at my watch because I do not want to overstep my time, but I want to work with these two twin disruptions of because of walking around the festival today, you really kind of absorb the extent to which our world has been disrupted by technological change. And I want to offer to you that we're also that, and that's sort of shaping our world, shapes this whole conference, right? But I want to offer the idea that we are also living in almost a concurrent, that the financial crisis was the second disruption, and we are sort of living in that world, and they all happened kind of concurrently. In a lot of ways, it was intertwined. So when you think about the financial crisis that happened, it's a U.S. product, our export to the world. You're welcome. But the key dates of the financial crisis is basically 2003 to 2007. That's when all of, as we'll see in a second, that's where all the sort of the mortgage products were created and sold across around the world. And when you sort of think about it, the technological change that kind of impacted journalism was happening right around then. Facebook was founded in 2004. We forget, right? And Twitter was founded in 2006. And if you really dig into the numbers about the newspaper industry, Google's effect really took hold second half of 2007. You can look it up. The whole thing fell apart. Craigslist and Google really became mainstream 2007. And like, as everyone sort of knows, remembers, the crisis occurred on September 15th, 2008. When you sort of think about it also, again, I'm looking at my watch because I got a lot of slides to do, but I feel like when you sort of think about it, the financial disruption and is so intertwined, interlinked with the technological change because the crisis was really like the culmination of technological advances on Wall Street that had begun in the 80s, even the 70s. And so this distribution of risk and the way that mortgages were put together in an instant, all were a result of technological change that drove the crisis to levels that that were unanticipated and with which we are still living today. So the way so what I'm going to do is I'm going to review the crisis a little bit, just to remind ourselves what happened, how it happened, and what I think the journalism problem was. Again, this is all in 15 minutes, and then I'm going to then sort of walk through the sort of the resultant or concurrent journalism crisis and try to sort of give you my take on why journalism remains extremely vulnerable today. And the title of this talk is Why We Remain Vulnerable to Unpleasant Surprises. So bear with me and we'll see how this works out. Are we? Yeah, okay. So right now we're in this kind of, the financial world looks like things have gotten back to normal, and I say that warning, the stock market is not a barometer of social health. I think everyone understands that. I think it's important to remember, this is like a very important slide, but it's hard to I'll have to explain it. This is Wall Street pay, and the average pay on Wall Street. And if you notice this, I can't really point, but just look at the vertical part. That's the years of the crisis. That's what's going on. That's when everybody's pay was jumping from, and that sort of material incentives led to systemic corruption. And it, it's sort of a heavy word, but that's sort of sort of shorthand for what actually happened. If you'll notice, the pay went up to over $400,000. Average on Wall Street. That includes secretaries and janitors and everybody else. So pay was just right through the roof, and it was all driven by incentives to sell mortgages. And all of this, you've got to remember, and what were they selling? These were subprime mortgages. That's a whole other can of worms, but this was this slide goes back to early 90s, but if you go back before, basically subprime didn't exist until 1990. And by the time we hit 2006, subprime, Alt-A, and all this other garbage that they were selling to people made up about 25% of the mortgage market. And again, you have to we're just reviewing it, doing it at 30,000 feet, but the mortgage market in the United States is enormous. Right? So it's a lot these are trillions of dollars, it's a lot of money. So the idea, and at the same time, all of this is, while Wall Street pay is going up, this is collateralized debt obligations, which were made from the same garbage that were the subprime mortgages. Also is spiking there. And each one of those CDOs that were sold, every mortgage that was sold, every mortgage-backed security was sold, generated a fee for somebody on Wall Street. Either it was a mortgage broker sitting in a strip mall in Phoenix, Arizona, or a bond trader on Wall Street. So don't forget that spike in Wall Street pay, and we're talking about, and this is credit to vol swaps also peaking at the same time. All right. And here's sort of like the thing that I think everyone, it's like what Wall Street will, with the stories that Wall Street tells itself, what they say is people, this is one of these, a Morgan Stanley guy, people are, but here's how they frame the question. People aren't going to be that stupid again, so they'll find another way to be stupid. I think there's going to be another crisis. Now, it sounds like a very sort of smart and self-criticism of Wall Street by savvy insiders. But the fact is, if you look back at this slide, this is not a picture of stupidity, right? This is not about stupidity. This is about people getting paid. So in other words, it's very, very important to sort of decode Wall Street and what and so sort of this post-crisis world we're living in is, and again, you just tell me 10 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever. This post-crisis world we're living in, is obviously again, we're sort of in this moment where the crash of September 15th, 2008 destabilized the entire world. It was in October of 2008 that Hungary had to declare default and had to turn to the IMF and receive $25 billion in bailouts, which came with extremely stringent austerity conditions. A year and a half later, we get Viktor Orban, 2010. But if you sort of repeat this sort of scenario around the world, you sort of realize the impact of this thing. And again, I'm sort of literally living in this with the consequences of this thing as a academic or as a teacher at this university. So these slides are basically pointing to this idea that many people were dissatisfied with the outcome of how the crisis was handled, and that it's important to remember that that the political economy that existed pre-2008 endures today. And the reason that's important is when you sort of think about our last great crash, 1929, the Roosevelt administration, when they finally got in 1933, basically changed the political economy of the country. So all of those institutions that we know of today, the SEC, Federal Deposit Insurance, the FHA, all of these things that were built to sort of protect depositors and were and basically Wall Street was never heard from again until like the 1970s. So that system sort of endured and completely shifted the economy. So what we have to remember is we're sort of still living in the same sort of political economy as we were before 2008. Everyone knows there hasn't been any. There's been literally zero criminal convictions of any Wall Street executive, and I think that's still sort of gnawing at the narrative of on the left and on the right as well, and sort of helps explain. These slides show you how again, same idea, political economy endures. The financial sector is still a way too big a piece of the American economy. Or that line going up to the right just means that those are more mouths that have to be fed. Those are people who need to get paid. The banks, the way they solved the financial crisis was not by putting banks into receivership, by selling some banks to other banks. Who can remember? Wall Street, J.P. Morgan bought Bear Stearns, if you remember. Goldman's Bank of America bought Wachovia. Anyway, they all merged together, and now we have this large, this banking sector that's as large as before. And so here's this thing: political economy endures. Student loans are at $1.3 trillion. $1.3 trillion. And so you sort of think about what are the risks, to the world. These are, this is a generational risks that we sort of, okay. So I had to kind of trying to deal with this. So what was missing, what happened, and I tried to, my book was about trying to come up with this idea of what happened, because my premise was I had worked at the Wall Street Journal for a long time, and I worked with all these people, and I think all of us here would agree that we're talking about a very talented, smart, tough, and very proud cohort of journalists who happen to be working in business journalism. So what happened? So I came up with this idea, a framework of access, this dichotomy of access versus accountability. And I know access journalism gets a bad name, but it's basically, these are sort of two competing poles of practice in journalism. Meera referred to Ida Tarbell's work, The History of the Standard Oil Company, published in the early 20th century. I mean, that was sort of the template for accountability reporting. You sort of see that what the thing to remember, the way I sort of see it is that, the access folks sort of speaks for the the idea sort of speaks for itself, but my paradigm for the template for access reporting is somebody who covers mergers and acquisitions. If you ever, nobody here follows business news, and that's fine, but that's like the ultimate sort of scoop getting, the ultimate kind of sought after scoop in business reporting is to report on the pending merger before it happens, because a lot of money's at stake. It requires all sorts of access to powerful people and in the corporate world and on Wall Street and the rest of it. And it's a very specific form of reporting, and there's not a thing wrong with it. However, what it doesn't do, if you're only going to be focusing on that type of thing, you're going to basically be missing the financial crisis, and that's why I had to kind of come up with the idea of accountability reporting basically being this. This is basically investigative reporting. It takes a long time. It's instead of getting reporting from the top down, you're reporting from the bottom up. Your sources are dissidents typically, and not in the executive suite. It just gives you an entirely different frame of reference for things financial. What the beauty of the financial crisis is, or the ugliness of the financial crisis is, it sort of showed, how all of these elite fixations and concepts that people were working with in derivatives and credit default swaps and all these sophisticated financial products were all connected down to somebody's mortgage in St. Louis. And so you couldn't understand the financial crisis without understanding this from the ground up and from the outside in, is the way I would put it. And there were people who were on this, and this is a piece from 2003 in this magazine that's now folded. It's by a reporter named Mike Hudson, who's went on to head the one of the top guys at the ICIJ. He now heads the AP's investigative unit. He's a friend of mine, but he was trying to he was connecting the dots to these abusive mortgages to the global financial system back in the day, and that's sort of my argument. Okay, so that's sort of the main sort of thing. So now we'll kind of get to where we are today in the journalism crisis, and everyone in this room is sort of familiar with these kind of slides. This is the crash of the advertising revenue of the newspaper business in the United States, which is by far the most sensitive to the digital disruption because we're so hyper commercialized. We don't have the big robust publicly funded journalism that they have in Europe, but Europe is obviously facing a crisis of its own that's going to be coming. And we've seen these slides where newspaper employment, and here's another, so everyone's sort of familiar with this sort of thing. It's like these boots on the ground that we're not. And here's like a really important, I think, thing that we forget. This was Jack Schaefer and some people at Politico did this piece, and it's like, the slide on the right is newspaper employment in 2016, and if you go back 10 years, those bubbles would be a lot bigger, right? And the slide on the left probably should be swapped, but the slide on the left is internet publishing employees. So you sort of have these kind of this retreat into media bubbles, right? Where media is basically based in New York, period, and a little bit in Washington, and that's about it, right? And internet publishing is more than journalism, but you sort of see. And there are these stats that just blow your mind because there's a stat that says that. Well, I wish I could remember, but it was that 90% of the people working in internet publishing are in counties, work in counties carried by Hillary Clinton, right? And 75% of those employees are working in counties that Clinton won by 30 points or more. So the entire world is sort of concentrated in this thing. And, you can't really be, this is the 2016 election, right, by county. You can't really be, my background is in local news, right? My first job was in Alabama, and my second job is in Rhode Island, and so I'm not saying I was like in touch with the people, but I was in touch with the people. It was just a fact, I was my first job was in agriculture. I was a farm reporter, and I interviewed people who would never have gotten to see me, and I would never have gotten to see them, and there was this connection, and there was a connection, and it's very important. I think that there's a very important kind of connection between people and their newspaper. And there used to be rather intimate, it was not always like a warm connection. It was so angry and resentful, et cetera, but you know, it was the paper sort of helped define the community. And you know, the consequences of this, I think, are just now being felt. And here's this piece that just came out by Politico again. Trump thrives in areas that lack traditional news outlets. And when you look at this, you're sort of faced with this idea of you know, just journalists not being connected, right, to people in other parts of the country, and et cetera. So so we're almost done. And I think you're kind of getting the point. You can kind of extrapolate this, right? So here's the Brexit map. And I'm not an expert on UK journalism, but I happen to know also that obviously the press is concentrated in London. And this is a map of Hungary. And orange is Viktor Orban's party. And that's a very deceptive. He's not that freaking popular. But it kind of conveys the point that in the middle is Budapest with the little white and green spots, and that's where all the media is, and there's a special kind of issue in Hungary, and Orban knows this very, very well. What he did was he had his oligarchs buy up every single local paper in Hungary, and all these are different websites. Somebody captured all the screenshots, different local newspapers around Hungary, basically with the same story at the same time. So in other words, that's hardly local news, right? So in other words, it's clearly, you know, a priority for illiberal, populist or Trumpist or Brexitist or whatever you want to call it, people to, you know, they know the importance of sort of this connection with local news that we sort of tend to forget. So, and this is sort of the end of my sort of thing. This is like, I don't mean to be hyper, you know, pessimistic or whatever, but this is just a slide about Yochai Benkler did a very important study about the 2016 election and how it was sort of played out. And those red dots are, you know, right-wing sites, and those are not just, those are hard-right sites. Those are Breitbart, Daily Caller, and the right and the left. This isn't like the Weekly Standard or the Spectator, that kind of thing. So anyway, it's a whole very important paper that I recommend to everyone. And the blue ones are mainstream media organizations, which are categorized as you know, left liberal. But the point being that we're sort of living in this moment where I feel like every time we're sort of living in this moment where we're very vulnerable to these, again, unpleasant shocks, these surprises. And Trump was a shock, Brexit was a shock, and if I had to sort of diagnose where journalism fits into this, it's sort of like because of economic disruption, technological change, and the logic of the internet and the way the world is, we are in danger of being sort of separated from, losing touch with people, and people losing touch with us. I think that's sort of how I would frame the problem.
Thanks, Dean. That's a really, really good view.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you. It's really important to kind of go back to this point that financial journalism is about it should be about connecting the media and society and power and money and reflecting how people live their lives and to give them a true picture of the choices they have in their life. You know, we should be able to explain that if you make certain life choices, this will be your financial situation at the end of it, and I do feel that that's something that's very missing. I'm going to go to Bill now, that's okay, who has done something quite incredible, and The Economist always, you know, draws kind of huge applause for doing what most people say is impossible, which is writing specialist news for an international audience without kind of compromising on quality or breadth or range. And I'd just like to talk to you really about what, you know, is this something that, well, I'll let you talk about what you want to talk about, but also just bear in mind whether this is kind of a model that you think can be expanded and replicated, because it's one of the very, very few publications that survived reputationally intact and is still going strong, and whether, what can other people learn from that?
Do I have to press a button, or is it just start? Maybe it just starts. Oh, it's just on. That's very good. Okay, well, thank you very much, and sorry to be a few minutes late. It was a mistake agreeing to do a radio interview that had a non-finite ending, it turned out. That's the trouble with radio. Let me reflect upon The Economist, which was where I spent the bulk of my career, and the way what Dean has outlined so excellently. And I'll say, so both about journalism and about the financial crisis. And I would say, by way of background, that in my kind of reporting and analyzing career, I'd say I've seen 3 or possibly 4 major financial booms and busts. The biggest early one in my career was the Japan crash of 1990. Then, and until 2008, was the biggest single collapse of financial system, stock and property markets that had happened since the 1930s. And the consequences of it are still going on today. Then there was the 97-98 Great East Asia and emerging markets collapse, including, as is often forgotten, the semi-default of Russia in that year. Then I would say one should never forget the NASDAQ, the tech crash of the early 2000s, and then the crash to not, unfortunately, end all crashes, but rather the crash to sear journalism careers, absolutely the one that Dean has said. What would I say about, how would I reflect on that? I mean, those comparisons, and look into the 2008 crash and the Economist's approach to that series of crashes and to the crash itself. First of all, I'd say I don't think where I agree with Dean is absolutely that what we're talking about is the corruption of a system, particularly a political system. And why is it a corruption of a political system? Because I believe in the run-up to the 2008 crisis, Wall Street basically bought politics and bought regulation and deregulation in such a way that led to the 2008 crisis. That began in the 1990s, and it began with the successful avoidance of regulation of the derivatives market, especially under the Clinton administration, the suborning, I would say, of Larry Summers and Bob Rubin at the Treasury, and so on. That then created the space for the subprime mortgage disaster that Dean has said. The same thing happened in other countries. So I don't think that we should see the 2008 crisis, I'm a bit different from Dean on this, as being an American export. The idea that it was an American export was a convenient excuse in Europe for a year or two, but didn't at all pass the test of reality once you saw what was happening in Ireland, once you saw what was happening in Greece, once you saw what was happening in Spain, which were similarly, in a very traditional way, property scandals full of corruption, full of delusion, with salary rates that would be similar to what was going on in Wall Street, and really reflected the same things. They were not caused by the subprime mortgage crisis. They were caused by a global credit bubble that economists will never entirely agree as to the origin of it. I believe that really the way we should look at this is that incredibly loose credit facilitated fraud and crime and corruption that was in turn made easier by the suborning of politics, direct bribery in some cases in Spain, probably in Ireland, but also the suborning of a political process in the United States that then made the space for the sort of crimes that then produced the sudden loss of confidence in the system that happened in 2008 beginning in America. So I think that it's not just an American issue, and it's essentially similar to the Japanese crash of 1990, and essentially similar to the East Asian financial crisis of 1997, except that everything in America is bigger, better, and faster. And so it was obviously of massive importance and massive political consequences. But also, I would say that the issues for journalism were the same in those crises as well, in my recollection of them. Now, I haven't done the sort of systematic and wonderful survey and so forth of either the run-up to the Japanese crisis or the 97 East Asian crisis that Dean's done, but I would think that we might see some of the same phenomena there. Why is that? It's because in a credit bubble, access reporting takes over from accountability reporting, because essentially journalists, the media, are part of a crowd that is running in a certain direction, is depending on its information on people who want to believe that that prices are going to go up forever. They want to believe, as Kenneth Rogoff put in the title of his book, that this time is different, and want to basically make their fortune before the music stops. And as Chuck Prince, the then head of Citibank, said, while the music's still going, you've got to dance, he said. You've got to carry on dancing. And media gets carried into that. What becomes missing, what becomes overlooked and often less emphasized, is the accountability role that Dean has rightly identified. That should be a role of identifying what we in England would call canaries in the coal mine, warnings of future crises and future dangers. Obviously, journalism should find criminality when it can, but also it should identify the systemic effects of that criminality. Why did that not happen adequately? I think Dean has analyzed it better than I could in the American context. I think that in the previous crises and in the 2008 crisis, I'd add that the difficulty is often the lack of transparency, the very lack of transparency that facilitates all sorts of skullduggery, but it means that actually it's quite difficult to find published information to analyze and to prove that things are being done wrong. It's difficult to connect the dots, and some of the incentives of editors start to change in addition towards believing the hype. And I think that that's what happened in all those three crises in their particular areas, that editors became part of the role of the part of the hype itself, and indeed not necessarily for corrupt reasons. Sometimes, of course, we all have corruption in our professions, but I think that mostly it becomes part of the cheerleading operation. And in the 2008 crisis, the key issue was that thanks to derivatives and other securities being essentially unregulated, not traded in registered exchanges, permitted to be stored in off-balance sheet entities in special purpose vehicles, not only did that make it extremely difficult to find out for journalists to find out what was going on, it actually meant that banks didn't know what was going on, that counterparties didn't know about each other, regulators didn't know what was going on, and so the whole shadow banking scene, combined with the mythology around securitization, the idea that risk, despite these incredibly dodgy subprime mortgages, which even for those who identified them, despite those, people would say, well, it's okay, those banks in Dusseldorf are buying these, the risk is being shared out, it'll all be fine, and that was a delusion. So we didn't ask the right questions loudly enough, and we didn't put the dots together. I think that the Economist position was an advantageous one in a sense, in that we're a global publication. We could connect together what was going on in a lot of different markets. that we could and did, I think, sound the alarm about property bubbles, including in the United States, including in Ireland, including in Spain. I had a brilliant economics editor at the time who was absolutely obsessed with house prices and built her own house price index before the Schiller case index for the US and was absolutely obsessed with it. So why didn't we warn everyone and prevent the crisis? Well, principally because I think we didn't connect adequately the unsustainable nature of what was going on with the true magnitude of the systemic risk. And I think we didn't ask the right questions. And secondly, because even if we had, our readers weren't in a mood to listen. What do I think since then? I think that the lack of punishment is the crucial thing, and Dean has absolutely correctly identified that. I think the lack of true reform in the status of the financial sector, not just in Wall Street, but in Britain, in France, in some other European countries, hasn't happened. And I think we can share some of the blame for failing to drive that. What has happened, though, I think, is that finally business models in journalism have converged on that of The Economist, which was principally a subscription title. Yes. Of course, we weren't wholly a subscription title. We were roughly 50-50 in my time between subscription and advertising. But the fact that we were a subscription title and had successfully built that as a premium pricing model for subscriptions, which Business Week, Fortune, Time, and Newsweek didn't. They went for a cut price pricing model in order to increase their rate base for advertising. The fact that The Economist had a strong premium-priced subscription basis, I think, incentivized and induced editorial to constantly seek to serve that base by increasing the value, trying to increase the value of what we were doing to the reader. So we had the reader in mind more than like a broader sense of the bottom line. And I think when advertising has kind of gone off the cliff, as that graph showed, and that's a worldwide phenomenon happening at an equal pace in Europe, we've been The Economist has been in a strong position to build the subscription base. I think that accountability journalism ought to be easier in a subscription business with a sense of a flow of revenue, but also a loyalty to readers rather than the blurring effect of advertisers and the blurring effect of like market-led revenue. But it depends on editors, and that the crucial people for accountability journalism, and I would say this, wouldn't I, as a former one, is editors. It's the journalists as well, but it's the editors who are necessary to give the space, to provide the trust, to provide the backing that a top accountability team, investigative team needs, and indeed the time to do the work to fail as well is what is needed. We certainly tried to do that at The Economist. My notoriety in Italy begins with investigative reporting on Silvio Berlusconi. That was the latest in a whole series of pieces of accountability journalism that we were aiming to do on what you might call malefactors of great wealth, as Teddy Roosevelt called them, and others called them, of bad businessmen. Formula One motor racing, Rupert Murdoch's tax evasion, and so on and so forth. We tried to do that, and absolutely, I know that it depends on the editor's backing, and I'm sure that's true in any journalistic organization. Is that likelier now? I think that the big tension is between the immediacy of the metrics that digital readership brings, the sense that the successful article is the one that has the highest metrics, and the idea that people's careers will be boosted if they have better metrics for their articles, versus the more profound impact that actually have a big impact on subscriptions and reputation. So I think people are converging on that model, but nevertheless it's distorted by the digital world.
Thank you very much, Bill. That's brilliant. Just adding to that point, one thing I wanted to say in my introduction about the opportunities for business journalism, because again, one thing that was very clear is after the crash in countries like India and Mexico, which had very limited kind of mainstream business reporting, the crash kind of provided an opportunity for people like Forbes to move in, but also for publications like Mint to take off, because there was an understanding that, you know, we all need to be doing this. And I think this is like an area where there is potential for growth as well, and there's a very clear business sense to be made, and they're very clear, and it should be easy to explain to readers why this information is important to them, again, by making it very clear that by understanding this, you're securing the financial stability of your family, which that should be a message which should be working and building into the business model, I think, of journalism. I'm going to move to Alexandra, and I've kept it for last because we've had a kind of look backwards in a way at, you know, all the things that have happened, and Alexandra was very keen to kind of move this forward, but also link this to kind of reporting the technology sector and seeing kind of the issues of the two, and also where we go forward from here. So Alexandra.
Yes, thank you. When Meera recruited me for this panel just 2 days ago, I thought about what I could probably add that was of value for you guys, because I've never been a financial expert really, but have focused in my writing on democracy and the digital world. And then I thought about some things that are actually parallels between the reporting and the coverage of the Lehman crisis 10 years ago, and now, if you'd call it a tech crisis these days, if you could already call it a crisis. And actually what Bill just did was really brilliant to lead to that. He said really smart things like we didn't ask the right questions loud enough, and also that editors became part of the cheerleading operation, and these are actually some things that have happened in the tech sector, and particularly tech reporting has been a lot of a cheerleading operation. So I came up with a few points where you can really see analogies and parallels between the Lehman thing and the current tech debate. The first thing that came into my mind was the whole topic of financial literacy. When I was running the business news desk at Süddeutsche back then, we really started from scratch in many respects to really tell people, oh, you know, you lost your money now, well, tough luck. You should have really been so much more informed, and now let's explain this to you, what these financial products are about. And yeah, many people discovered they were just, their banks just sold them products that they didn't even know that there was a risk involved, because they just believed into this hype that, you know, oh, you can gain like 7% on your investments, or you can even gain 15%. So many people, many just regular consumers made lots of unwise choices about their financials. So financial literacy was really something that reporting really had to step up. And the same thing is today in terms of literacy about the tech sector and media literacy, in particular about the tech sector, because, well, many people don't know what the business models are that are behind these platform companies, Facebook, etc. You know, they don't know that lots of their choices are structured by algorithms and not by, you know, just what their friends see, but that algorithms really filter what their friends see. So you might all be familiar with that stuff, but many people are definitely not, and they believe what's on the internet. So there's a lot of literacy and training to be done. Then we had this whole, after following the Lehman crisis, we had this whole debate about the tech sector and the male culture. Remember that we were talking about Lehman Brothers and Lehman Sisters, and would this have happened if we had just Lehman Sisters? Well, look at the tech sector. I mean, that's been a topic for quite a while now, but only has been stepping up the topic in the past 2 years that, you know, is it really good that we just have this male culture in Silicon Valley and beyond, and in tech companies? And does it matter really? Does it matter for the products? Does it matter for innovation? Or, you know, should we just put up with it and tell the girls, oh, study all the natural sciences and math, and then, you know, the thing will solve itself? Or does it really shape our our assessment of risks, our assessment of our choices, the products that are sold in the digital world. So this whole debate about male culture really dominating the tech sector is really a big point. Then this was something that you were saying before, the incentive structure. You showed this incredible thing about Boni. We as journalists do really well when we look at incentive structures in certain areas, in certain industries, even in our own industry. How do people get to make money? How are the bonuses? What's rewarded in a company? And definitely the incentive structure in the financial industry was a big topic that really led to this crisis. Well, in the tech sector, there are certain incentive structures. There are incentives for just selling high and selling an idea and then getting money for this idea. And so it's a huge incentive structure that's not linked to values, ethical considerations. It's just an incentive structure that really is a big motivation for people to found their own companies, get business angels, get funding, get investments, and then after a while sell it for so many, whatever, million so the incentive structure is really something that journalism should look at in every context. Now also in the tech context. The other learning I find is that everybody has to understand that there is no free lunch, really. And I mean, that sounds like a no-brainer, but back then, people really believed, oh, you know, if we invest our money correctly, then we can gain all these, as I said before, we can make all this money on this, and we are just stupid to just let our money sit around. We really need to just some smart investments. And then in the end, people were really surprised very often that how much or how big the share of the fees were that they were actually paying these bankers for, and that's why the incentives for the bankers here, the incentives come in again. Really, the bankers sold them products just because they made these huge fees, and people just believed, oh, this is all, you know, this financial investment that I made, this is all my money, and it goes back to me. So this no free lunch thing, if you link it to the tech sector, obviously, every one of us is paying with our data. There is no free lunch on Facebook or Google and whatever, and I mean, we have been pretty aware of this, but we tend not to think about it too much because it's just so convenient, and it seems like we have these wonderful free products, but they're actually not free. Nothing is free. Yeah, and another point is this too big to fail. I mean, when we saw Lehman happening 10 years ago, obviously this discussion came up. This is too big to fail, so it needs to be bailed out. I mean, obviously, a bank failing and then state finances being attached to it, whatever, is a much bigger economic problem. But now look at Facebook, look at regulation. I mean, we have this too big to fail thing also because we depend so much on communications and on our also journalistic products through and distributing our stuff through these channels and communicating with people and with our friends and whatever through these platforms, that we don't even think about, well, you know, if you regulate Facebook, do you regulate free speech? Actually, we should make sure that there are still several opportunities to really exercise free speech and make sure that there's not just one Facebook dominating the world, and when it's regulated or shut down or whatever, or breaks down or when it goes bankrupt, that our whole communication structures fall apart. So the too big to fail is a real thing. And well, last but not least, the ethical framework, I mean, that was something that's about what Bill said about the cheerleading operation. Also the lack of transparency that Bill mentioned, that I also find it's another interesting point. Look at the ethical framework where these business models are based upon, and you remember when the Uber debate kicked off, really. Yeah, people were saying, oh, that was a great service. And, well, this guy, Kalanick, he might have been a little bit weird, but, you know, it's a great company and it's wonderful. But nobody really wanted to think about, you know, the conditions for
employees that are not really employees because they work for their own risks and whatever. So this whole ethical debate about how employment is in the tech sector, and that's a really important thing to look at. So looking back now, the 10 years to the crisis back then, and I mean, depends on how optimistic you wanna be. I mean, at least the world economy didn't collapse. Really, we are still alive, and there was some regulation coming out of this that's been working. So we have stable banks again. Savings have been guaranteed for people. The whole banking sector lost its reputation. So being a banker today is not as glossy or glorified any longer than it used to be. But we still have the same incentive structures in the financial industry. At least we have lots of it. So that would be something that you would have to answer. You know, how high is the risk that we're doing this again? Referring this to the tech sector, we'll probably see some regulation now because there's just no way around it, and it's actually done by lots of people who don't have the first idea what they're regulating. You could see that in the Zuckerberg hearings the last few days. There is a big loss of reputation for the tech sector, but I'm sure the incentive structures will remain the same for a while. So let's see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, thank you very much for kind of pointing out that the debates are still going on and valid in every sector, basically. And tech and the platform companies is very clear from the Senate hearing of Zuckerberg. You know, the people questioning and the people who are going to be writing the regulation don't necessarily, in fact, don't understand what they're dealing with at the moment, and we'll have to learn very fast. We have about 15 minutes, so I'm happy to open it up for questions, if people have any. If not, I have some. Any questions? If not, I had one for Bill, because I've noticed that you had China written down on your notebook. And this is the one thing about over there.
Okay, yes, okay.
I mean, basically how do we report on two things? Like, firstly, you know, China dealing with technology, but also how do we report on the Chinese economy in a way that's meaningful and fair to all sides?
Well, difficult questions, particularly in the limited time. But I just, first of all, let me explain why I wrote, actually I'd forgotten I'd written China down. It's because listening to Alexandra's very interesting thoughts about the tech sector, and part of me said, actually, in some ways you could say possibly that the tech sector will be the guys who, and it will be guys, who take the hit, in a way, for the financial crisis, in the sense that you're going to, finally somebody will have a real surge of regulation of them. Mm-hmm. But then it occurred to me that actually their great defense, once they've exhausted the defense of, well, we're giving you great services for free, is, but if you stop us, then Chinese companies are going to dominate tech. That we're in a technological arms race between China and the United States. And personally, I think that this is a bit of mythology, but and misunderstands what really are the value creation and the issues raised by some of these tech companies. But nevertheless, that will be an argument that will be used and rehearsed considerably. So to perhaps segue into your second question then, how do we report about China? I think it is a less transparent system. It is harder to do accountability reporting. Chinese accountability reporting has typically been, in my knowledge of it, and I'm not a deep specialist of it, but my knowledge of it is that it's been, in a sense, permitted accountability, in that particularly the publication that foreign media tended to get to know was the publication Kai-Ching, if I've pronounced it correctly, where a great editor called Hu Shuli drove a large number of investigative stories, but essentially what she was able to do was, if you like, investigate the things that the powers that be that surrounded her allowed her to investigate. In other words, it was as if she was a semi-tame watchdog, a watchdog who had to know where the line was, who had to know that you didn't look into certain people's wealth, you didn't look into certain people's sectors, but that it was welcomed, you were welcomed in looking in some sectors as part of the regulatory and the disciplining process in a fast-evolving, emerging economy. Now we're in a phase in China in which the media is being given the what they won't call the Viktor Orban treatment, but nevertheless is essentially the same thing, a muzzling of the media, and that sort of accountability, permitted accountability reporting isn't happening. As we report it as the international press, I think that one of the difficulties is in unraveling the role of the financial system in China, in that the difference between the Chinese economy and like the Japanese economy or the European or German economy or the American economy is that essentially it's a state-run financial system, so that while we may look for booms and busts and oncoming credit crises and look at graphs that show unsustainable things, and we think, well, there's bound to be a banking crisis here, actually it's under state control. So what that means is that it's a fiscal crisis if there ever is a financial real bust or an unraveling of excessive debt. And then the difficulty is that the consequences of a fiscal crisis are essentially political. And politics is in some ways a harder thing to unravel. And then you have added onto it the fact that Chinese data, of course, is unreliable. You can say that about a lot of data, but nevertheless, Chinese data is especially unreliable because it's quite political. So that's where we are.
Thank you. I mean, before I joined Oxford, I was working in Singapore for a German newspaper, and it was kind of interesting with Singapore because it wants to be a financial and information hub for the region and for the world, really. And, you know, it's very low corruption overall as a country, but there are certain families and certain individuals you really can't report on, and they're going to hit the wall very soon of how can you truly say you're going to be a hub for the media and the communication industries worldwide unless you allow true transparency into your own affairs, which they don't because they have a kind of state fund that kind of controls people's pensions, and it's very closed. They let you know. So I think it is kind of wider thing of can you be truly democratic and open without laying open your books for journalists?
No, absolutely.
And the answer is probably no, but a lot of countries are trying. I just had a quick question. I'm assuming everyone here follows the news. Can you just raise your hands if you read the financial press on financial news stories on a weekly? Okay, that's good. But that's, given that it's slightly self-selecting, it's still only about half. We just want to know. Sorry, there's some questions back there. Hi. Hi, yeah.
Hi, just a quick one for each of the panelists. What's the biggest risk to the global economy that's not being reported on properly today? Given that we didn't report it properly for the last one.
Good. I have a thought.
You don't know what you don't know, but I would put two things. One, it would be it's not that it's unknown, but the extreme instability brought about by this high level of wealth and income inequality. And when you sort of look at that's sort of this slow motion train wreck. And then the fast motion train wreck, probably the people who sort of in the know do think about China as, I was at the Los Angeles Times not too long ago reporting about finance. When people talk about the next big place to crash would be China, because as Bill says, the whole place is completely opaque. And all of the lending to corporate loans are really made on political basis. No one knows what the books are. The books are completely unkosher. No one can tell like who owes who to what, how highly leveraged the system is. So the really way to kind of, and how do you report on that? Well, you really have to be on the ground in China, understanding like what these companies are actually doing and how they're. It's very, very, it's a very difficult task. But that's sort of those. If I had to guess, I mean, the smart money was always talking about China as like the next big shoe to drop. So that'd be my answer.
I think my quick question on a kind of more social thing is like, I think cost and access to education, because this can end up being a real political flashpoint in countries where you have young men usually, or teenagers, who feel they don't have the opportunities that other people in their society around the world have. And I don't think the economics of schooling and universities has fully been factored in to the budget. And the other thing is food security, which, again, if we go back to China, is buying up, it's kind of ensuring its food security by buying up huge chunks of land in Africa and so on. And at some point, this could easily trigger a crisis.
If I could just, I was just sort of thinking, and we sort of think about, Brexit and Trump, and all of these are sort of flashing red light distress signals from the population as a whole, like something is seriously. So we're kind of we're obviously sort of in the crisis, but I know you're referring to kind of this financial, the thing where we kind of associate with bank failures and stock market crashes and that kind of thing. But obviously, it's not too much of a stretch to say that we're in a pretty severe crisis now.
Yeah, I mean, that Brexit and Trump and the sort of graphs that Dean put up brilliantly were reflections of the fact that why were these things a surprise? Well, the reason is because we thought that 8, 9, 10 years after the crash, things were improving. And I say we, I hope it's not me, but what generally was underappreciated was the fact that actually things weren't improving, that the consequences of the financial crisis were much more profound and deep set, and that even after a number of years of kind of technical recovery, actually median household income was only up by the amount that in Dean's chart was shown. And if you look at Italy, real household incomes are still below what they were in 2007. Italy is one of the few countries that has not, in the big countries, that has not got back above its GDP level or GDP per head level from pre-crash. And yet people talk about Italy as having had an economic recovery in recent periods. Well, the disconnect. So it's a failure of analysis. It's not really a failure of reporting. And indeed, I would agree in the other answers that often it's about politics where the big underappreciated risks are. It's not that they're underreported, it's that it's very hard to analyze them. And a reality that goes around at the moment is that you would seem, particularly anyone who looks at stock markets as any kind of indicator, as Dean said, they're not an indicator of social health, but also they're not an indicator of economic sustainability. And there's been, as it were, seemingly horrible political times, but economic times improving, so forth. We don't think, we've got complacent about the idea that actually there's going to be a connection between these 2 points. And in part, that can come with conflict in Syria between Russia and the United States. It can come through North Korea. It can come through political crisis in China, as Dean has said. That brings politics back into the heart of the future of the world economy.
Okay, thank you. I know there are more questions, but we are also out of time. Sorry? Yeah, we'll kind of hover outside and happy to answer any more questions. In the meantime, thank you very much for coming, and thank you also to the panelists. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't get your answer. Sorry, but.